Hello. The title of this lecture is Sixties Culture. In the 1960s and earlier, most scholars portrayed fundamentalism as the quote, movement of the socially backward, intellectually stunted, theologically naive, and psychologically disturbed. There was no appreciation that most fundamentalists were likely ordinary Bible believing people upholding the fundamentals of Christian orthodoxy in their daily lives. Scholars like H. Richard Niebuhr explain fundamentalism within the context of an urban/rural conflict. Quote, its popular leader was the agrarian William Bryan. Its rise coincided with the depression of agricultural values after World War I. It achieved little strength in the urban and industrial sections of the country, but was active in many rural states. End of quote. From this perspective, fundamentalists were provincial people, whereas city people were progressive and sophisticated. Many scholars writing about fundamentalism argue that it was anti intellectual. Historian Richard Hofstadter claimed that fundamentalism was not only anti intellectual, but it was a result of status anxiety. Along this argument, fundamentalists were anxious people because they lost power, influence, and respect in society. American History Survey texts published in the 1960s depict fundamentalism as an anti intellectual, unscientific, and rural phenomenon. As a result of revisionist works of historians such as Ernest Sandin, George Marsden, Joel Carpenter, to name only a few, there is a better understanding of the complexity of fundamentalism. For one, it turns out that fundamentalism was just as popular in American cities as it was in the South and rural areas. And it was not simply a conservative attitude of mind, but a blend of dispensational premillennialism, Princetonian biblicism, and Scottish common sense realism. Historian Timothy Weber wrote, quote, we now know that fundamentalism is a much more complex phenomenon than previously imagined. It is urban and rural, sophisticated and simplistic, intellectual and anti-intellectual, moderate and militant. In short, fundamentalism is much more diverse geographically, socially, politically, educationally, and theologically than its negative public image portends. Academic descriptions of conservatism in general also have shortcomings. In the 1960s, liberal scholars viewed the radical right as peripheral. The radical right was, quote, an episodic disruption of American political life, end of quote. It was a revolt against modernity, explaining status politics. Again, Richard Hofstadter argued that, quote, American emphasis on success and the considerable fluidity of American society made Americans especially preoccupied with their status, that is, their relative economic and social standing, end of quote. Other scholars likewise saw the radical right as a marginal phenomenon that would have no long-term significance. Well, they were wrong. Conservatism became a force after the 1960s. The three major elements of conservatism were libertarianism, social traditionalism, and militant anti-communism. Behind these elements was the belief that American society on all levels had a self-regulating and harmonious organic order, disturbed, quote, only by misguided ideas and policies, especially those propagated by liberal elites in the government, the media, and the universities. Conservatives argued that family, morality, religion, and gender roles would be smoothly intact if liberal elites had not encouraged permissiveness, secularism, alternate lifestyles, and feminism. This conservative thinking shared common ground with fundamentalism and evangelicalism. To better understand the relationship between evangelicalism and fundamentalism, one must examine the 1950s and 1960s when it was often difficult to distinguish the two. There were fundamentalist leaders who adopted a softer approach. By the early 1950s, the National Association of Evangelicals had over 1,300,000 members, and they represented over 30 denominations. There were many fundamentalists in the NAE. More separatist fundamentalists supported the rival American Council of Christian Churches instead. Some large groups remained outside, at least in theory, both fundamentalism and the NAE. There were many fundamentalists in the Southern Baptist Convention, but Southern Baptist leaders resented Northern fundamentalists making premillennialism a test of orthodoxy. And I'll return to the Southern Baptist shortly. As for the NAE, the National Association of Evangelicals, its most important spokesperson was evangelist Billy Graham, a fundamentalist with a softer tone. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, Graham's revival campaigns held in major cities and covered by print and frequently by radio and then later television had a far-reaching impact. His focus was on a message of sin and salvation. His goal was to share Christ and state the necessity for repentance of sins and thus revival. Actually, revivalism, where fundamentals of the Bible were preached, was accepted by a broad range of Americans. In the mid-20th century, it was difficult. It was difficult to view Christianity as something distinct from popular culture. Settling into the marketplace of culture, evangelicalism found expression in various popular mediums. A Harper's Magazine writer proclaimed religion is booming in America. An Atlantic Magazine commentator wrote, faith is fashionable. And Life magazine noted that Billy Graham preached to a gathering of 100,000 at one service in Yankee Stadium. A senior editor of Reader's Digest, Stanley High, covered revival crusades and wrote, quote, statistically, the success of Billy Graham, important and impressive as it is only one among many indications that by every quantitative measurement, religion in the United States is booming. By 1960, official church membership ranged between 57 and 69% of the total population. Thus, at the beginning of the 1960s, there could have been as many as 6 to 7 people out of every 10 would be attending church. quite a high number, 6 of 10, or even better, 7 of 10. In one poll, as many as 79% proclaimed themselves members of a church, inspiring one commentator to remark that religion probably played a greater role in the United States than any other modern industrial state. And there are often references to Europe, where the church attendance was significantly lower, much lower. A Gallup poll revealed that 80% of the American electorate would not vote for an atheist for president under any circumstances. Biblical ideals were an important component of American democracy and the moral development of the nation. This was illustrated when Moody Bible Institute had these creationist science films that were regularly shown at US military bases in the mid 20th century. Concerned with character development, military leaders wanted servicemen to receive instructions on Christian belief and democratic ideals. Now, it's helpful to put this in the context of the Cold War, particularly early 1950s when we have the Korean War, but the concern of communist infiltration in government in the 50s. By offering a common sense interpretation of the world, fundamentalists from Moody Bible Institute successfully promoted Christianity to countless servicemen under the auspices of the federal government. The persistence of fundamentalism was also obvious at the Seattle's World Fair of 1962. The Moody Bible Institute's Sermons from Science, located in a modest pavilion, inspired very vocal praise for its simplicity, clarity, and beauty. Nothing had been settled since the Scopes trial of 1925. An important purpose of the Seattle Fair was to celebrate science and technology. The science community, however, was powerless to present scientific accomplishments without including religion in some fashion. The American Scientific Affiliation was an evangelical organization designed to reconcile conservative evangelicalism and science, and it had some success. Its existence indicated that the position of mainstream scientists was contested. American culture offered fertile soil for the growth of biblical perspectives of science. In the 1960s, fundamentalists made headway with creation science. One creationist who joined the American Scientific Affiliation was Henry Morris, a Southern Baptist who, after graduation from college, began research on creationism. After receiving his PhD in engineering, he combined his efforts with John Whitcomb, and they authored the Genesis Flood. This was published in 1961. The Genesis Flood argued for a recent creation of the entire universe. Scholarly looking with footnotes, the Genesis Flood brought about a stunning renaissance of flood geology. The book captured the attention of Walter Lammert, who had a doctorate in genetics, Lamert, Morris, and several other strict creationists formed the Creation Research Society in 1963. Upset with how the ASA flirted with evolution, the CRS required members to sign a statement of belief accepting the inerrancy of the Bible, the special creation of all types of living things, and a worldwide deluge. When it was formed in 1941, the ASA did not adopt any one creationist interpretation. It accepted the support of strict creationists, but it was wary of any absolutism of science. It is notable that the Creation Research Society members required a graduate degree in science. The CRS also published a journal. Certainly within conservative Christian circles, there was much opposition to evolution. At the start of the creationist revival, the gap between liberals and conservatives was far. In 1963, one sociological survey revealed that only 11% of liberal Protestants opposed evolution, whereas 72% of Southern Baptists opposed evolution. The revival of creationism in the 1960s was under the radar of most people. Fundamentalists only began to make a more public stand when the federally funded biological science curriculum study text featured evolution. In the late 1960s, two housewives, Nell Seagraves and Jean Summerall, who had connections with the Creation Research Society, pressured the California State Board of Education to include creation along with evolution in public school textbooks. Historian Ronald Numbers writes, quote, in 1961, Seagraves learned of the U.S. Supreme Court's ruling in the Madeline Murray case protecting atheist students from required prayers in public schools. Murray's ability to shield her child from religious exposure suggested to Seagraves that creationist parents like herself were entitled to protect our children from the influence of beliefs that would be offensive to our religious beliefs, end quote. It was this line of argument that finally persuaded the Board of Education to grant creationists equal rights. Turning to another topic, political action was a significant story in the southern states. The political landscape of the South changed in the 1960s. As historian George Morrison writes, only after white Southerners were no longer automatically voting Democratic was it possible to organize a truly national movement of political conservatives. Furthermore, once civil rights receded as the defining political issue, so that not everything that Southern conservatives did was dismissed by their critics as motivated by veiled racism, the door was open to martial Southern conservative political strategies, end quote. However, any exploration of conservatism in the South had to deal with the Southern Baptist Convention, the largest Protestant denomination in the United States. Many fundamentalists within the Southern Baptist Convention preferred to be called conservatives. And clearly, conservatives transformed the Southern Baptist Convention. Believing that American culture opposed traditional forms of faith, conservative Baptists in the South forcefully entered the culture war, seeking to hold the line against liberal and modernist influences. This was not always the case. Fundamentalists in the Southern Baptist Convention were slow to take a stand against liberalism. For one thing, in the 1930 to 1960 period, there was not enough modernism in the South to cause alarm. Because there was no strong liberal secular culture in the South in earlier decades, there was very little organized fundamentalism. Moreover, in the 1960s and earlier, the Southern Baptist Convention represented diverse constituencies and that were held together on the model of a grand compromise. The grand compromise allowed diversity, all in the hope of maintaining unity. Moderate Southern Baptists had little desire to critique their culture. Besides, the cultural crisis that fundamentalists faced in the North during the first half of the century did not become obvious in the South until after the 1960s. The most ambitious goal of conservatives was to wrest control from the hands of moderates of the Southern Baptist Convention and all its agencies, including the 6 Southern Baptist Convention seminaries. In his book, Uneasy in Babylon, Southern Baptist Conservatives and American Culture, Barry Hankin claims that this episode, known as the Southern Baptist controversy, was one of the most contentious and significant denominational battles in American religious history. Soon after the 1960s, Southern Baptists became more visible and influential with their conservative opposition to secular forces. Another group of conservative Christians who began to make connections with the business world was the Full Gospel Businessmen Fellowship. So here we have an example of actually a Pentecostal group who began to become a little bit more engaged with culture. Now, this group was founded in 1951 in Los Angeles by Demos Shakarian. Demos Shakarian was an Armenian American Pentecostal millionaire dairy farmer. The fellowship began as a Pentecostal parachurch organization, but membership was open to all Christian men regardless of ecclesiastical and theological background. To protect his lay character, clergy and other full-time gospel workers were denied official leadership roles. So we have the Full Gospel Businessmen's Fellowship. Full gospel referred to the preaching of the entire Testament, including faith healings, speaking of tongues, and deliverance from demonic forces. This kept many fundamentalists away, but other conservative Christians participated. Businessmen included chief executive officers, entrepreneurs, professionals, politically connected men, military officers, farmers, white-collar employees, and laborers. The fellowship encouraged men back into church life and thus readdressed the predominance of females in many churches. Females were prohibited from full membership. The FGBMF meetings, usually held in the relaxed and non-ecclesiastical atmosphere of restaurants and hotels, consisted of non-sectarian gatherings of men who share how God works in a positive and powerful way in their lives. At each meeting, an invitation was given to men to turn their lives over to Jesus. Adopting modern business techniques of organization and communication, The fellowship later aligned with the Christian right of the 1980s. The Shakarian story and fellowship development are rooted in prophecy. As told by Demos Shakarian, the Shakarian family was living in Armenia, and other Armenian Christians received prophecy in the 19th century directing them to relocate in Western United States to escape terrible danger from Turkish foes in future Armenia. In the new land, the Shakarians would prosper under God's blessing. Well, the Shakarian business became the largest dairy farms in California. And actually, by the war years, that is World War II, it became the largest private dairy in the world, at least according to Demos Shakarian. Just actually before World War II, Demos received a personal prophecy from a house painter friend named Milton Hansen that God had chosen him to speak of holy matters with heads of states around the world. Shakarian met and became close friends with Englishman and healing evangelist Dr. Charles Price, who preached the full gospel. Price's preaching, healing efforts, and prophecy influenced Shakarian and his vision of a layman's revival. In the early 1940s, Shakarian was president of a chapter of the Christian Business Men Committee, the CBMC, an organization of evangelical laymen. It struck Shakarian that during religious meetings, women far outnumbered men. Accustomed to Armenian men being the prime movers in the church, he found it confusing that American men had given up the highest calling of all. Shakarian realized that many of the men he came in contact with never spoke about God, and he responded by organizing religious tent meetings that reached out beyond the inward-looking Armenian community. One notable event organized by Shakarian was a major Pentecostal youth rally that filled the Hollywood Bowl in 1948. In the wake of the Los Angeles Pentecostal evangelistic meetings held by evangelist Oral Roberts in 1951, Shakarian launched the first meeting of the Full Gospel Businessmen's Fellowship. And it was basically a Pentecostal version of the Christian Businessmen's Committee. Held in Los Angeles, only 18 men attended. And two of them was Demos and his wife. So Demos, his wife, and 16 others attended. Initially named the Full Gospel Businessmen's Fellowship of America, the elected president was Demos, and the key officers included a banker, automobile salesman, building contractor, and a public accountant. Shakarian and other fellowship officers worked without salaries. Meetings took place in hotels and ballrooms. Eventually, International replaced America in the official charter. Thus, the Full Gospel Businessmen Fellowship International was at this point, what we have the importance of a doctrinal statement that required members to believe in the Trinity, infallible Bible, in sanctification by the blood of Christ, in divine healing, and in the baptism in the Holy Spirit, accompanied by signs of the Spirit. While the connections to Pentecostalism were strong, the FGBMFI adopted interdenominationalism, preferring that people remain in their own churches. The early leaders came from several churches: the Assemblies of God, the Pentecostal Holiness Church, the Church of God, the International Church of the Foursquare Gospel, and the Pentecostal Church of God. Now, people who went on to become members of the various chapters of the fellowship could not be a clergyman. Actually, the clergy, the pastors, feared that Shakarian was seeking to create a new denomination, but he reassured them that this was not the case. The fellowship leaders maintained that the driving force of the movement was the Holy Spirit. Soon the fellowship became international more than just in name. For example, in 1955, Johannesburg, South Africa was the site of the first overseas chapter. A fellowship chapter in Toronto, Canada formed the following year. On the issue of race, the fellowship moved the site of its Atlanta convention to Denver when the hotel made arrangements to segregate Black businessmen into nearby accommodations. Shakarian's position broke down barriers among Blacks who viewed the fellowship as the exclusive domain of white men. From its beginning, the fellowship chose not to focus on healing, concerned that this issue would receive all the attention. So, 2 points here. One, they did not want to brand it in a fashion that everyone and people who just would believe that this was just a Pentecostal organization. And secondly, they wanted to make clear to all that both Blacks and whites were welcome within the fellowship. By 1961, 18 nations were represented at the first European Convention in Zurich, Switzerland. To spread its influence, the fellowship began organizing airlifts to countries throughout the world. An airlift was when a group of fellowship members financed with their own money a visit to a country for the purpose of sharing the gospel. Airlifts occurred throughout the world, including war-torn destinations such as Vietnam. Beginning in 1963, a series of fellowship booklets promoted neo-Pentecostal renewal. And this was also occurring in other denominations among the Baptists and Methodists. By the late 1960s, the fellowship also began to make an impact on the Catholic charismatic movement. Tension remained between fundamentalists and Pentecostals, but the Men's Business Fellowship foreshadowed that various conservative groups, normally unsupportive of each other, were open to work together against secular forces that were hostile to all conservative Christians. To conclude, Christian conservatism began to look different in 1969 than was the case at the beginning of the decade. Protestant church attendance was high in 1960 as many Americans viewed Christian living as important. Scholars continued to look down on fundamentalists, but church leaders such as Billy Graham were popular. Moody Bible Institute was active in discussing the connections, the relations, the compatibility of the Bible and science. By the end of the 1960s, there were also clear signs that Southern Baptist conservatives were preparing to take a larger role in confronting hostile progressive ideas. Finally, the Full Gospel Businessmen's Fellowship of America was evidence of Pentecostals showing more engagement with the business world and other conservative Christians. Greater cooperation between various conservative Protestant groups and Catholics was around the corner. Thank you.